O.J. Simpson not guilty on all counts. The victims' families don't see it that way.
People believe that this country lost today. Justice was not served.
Welcome to Under Scrutiny. Good evening, I'm Jane Wallace. Here's what's happening. As you just heard, if you haven't already, O.J. Simpson was acquitted of murder charges in the deaths of his ex-wife Nicole and of Ronald Goldman. We'll have a lot more on the Simpson story in just a moment. In Washington today, President Clinton vetoed a budget that pays Congress's expenses. Mr. Clinton said Congress should not take care of its own business before taking care of the people's business. And Hurricane Opal is headed for the Gulf Coast. It has already killed at least 10 people in Mexico. Coastal flooding has begun in Texas. Under Scrutiny tonight looks at the Simpson verdict. For many, it was a vindication of the justice system. For others, it was a travesty of justice. Elation for O.J. Simpson as the verdict is read.
In the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA097211. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Ronald Lyle Goldman, a human being, as charged in count 2 of the information.
A time of despair and frustration for the families of the victims.
Action further find a special circumstance that
Last June 13th, 94, was the worst nightmare of my life. This is the second.
The prosecution lawyers were deeply disappointed as well.
No one here has spared any effort. Everyone here has put in 110%, given their all for everyone, for justice, for the families of the victims, in the effort to see that the lives of Ron and Nicole were not thrown away. It was a dignified fight. It showed great courage, great integrity, great moral strength. And we have every reason to be proud of every single one of them, and we are. Thank you.
We came here in search of justice. You will have to be the judges, I expect, as to whether or not any of us found it today. But I'm not bitter, and I'm not angry. But I'd also like to thank the lawyers on our prosecution team. I am honored to have.
Defense lawyer Johnny Cochran said jurors did not ignore the facts. Cochran said the jury understood the defense effectively knocked down the prosecution.
If you didn't believe the timeline, if you didn't believe that O.J. Simpson had enough time to commit this crime, that he couldn't go upstairs, change clothes, bathe, throw away all the clothes, the gun, the knife, the weapon, the shoes, and all that stuff, Ms. Clark gave him 5 minutes to do all that.
After the verdict, Jason Simpson read a statement from his father.
But when things have settled a bit, I will pursue, as my primary goal in life, the killer or killers who slaughtered Nicole and Mr. Goldman. They are out there somewhere.
Outside the courthouse, many were jubilant. Like so much in this case, reactions seemed to break down along racial lines. Many African Americans supporting the verdict. Many whites thinking Simpson was guilty. Within minutes of the verdict, O.J. Simpson was on his way home, and his ordeal ended, oddly, a lot like it began. Cameras in helicopters followed his police-escorted journey back to his Rockingham estate. Even though there will be no more criminal charges, O.J. Simpson hardly returns to life as he knew it. Simpson faces a mountain of bills from his high-priced defense team. The Goldman and Brown families each have civil suits pending against him, and Nicole Brown Simpson's parents still have custody of his 2 youngest children. Our questions tonight: was justice served? Did emotion override the facts? What does the verdict mean for the judicial system and police departments in this country? Joining us tonight in Los Angeles, defense attorney John Burris. In Miami, jury consultant Sanford Marks. In New York, Otto Obermeyer, former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Criminal defense attorney David Lewis. Robert Gottlieb, criminal defense attorney, and Mary Shannon Little, former prosecutor, now a managing director at Kroll & Associates. We've got a lot of guests. I want to keep it moving tonight, and we've got a lot to talk about. John Burris, let me begin with you. Is this the juice is loose, long live the juice, or is this a guy who got away with murder?
No, I don't think it's a guy who got away with murder. I think this is very clear that the prosecution did not have sufficient evidence. There were real questions about police contamination, police conduct, and misconduct. And the Mark Furman issue was paramount here, along with the timeline problems and the lack of motive on the part of the Jews. So clearly, the defense did their job. The prosecution did not.
Mary Shannon Little.
Yeah, it's clear that the defense did their job, but the prosecution did have enough evidence. The prosecution just didn't know how to do it. They spared no effort, but they did spare judgment.
The defense didn't win, the prosecution lost.
Absolutely.
Okay, Robert Gottlieb.
You know, in a case like this, you can't look at Mark Furman, you can't look at one mistake. This case was botched from day one. It's not the fault of the prosecution necessarily, from the first investigators on the scene, the medical examiner who they couldn't even call as a witness.
Wait a minute, how can you say it wasn't the prosecution? Gil Garzetti was on television 5 days after the fact, before he had a shred of DNA evidence saying, "We've got our guy."
The reason I can say that it's not the prosecution is that the prosecution and any prosecutor knows that you have to go with the facts, the evidence, the quality of the investigation that's given to you from day one. And in this case, this investigation from day one was pathetic.
Okay.
Yes, that's right, but you don't have to go.
Hang on a second, Sandy Marks. Hang on. Go ahead, David Lewis, then Sandy Marks.
There's a world of difference between what we've seen and heard and what the jury's seen and heard. And the jury made the decision on what was in the courtroom and what was in front of them. We have so much more data, and it's almost impossible to separate our opinions so that we could even be jurors and say what it is they decided.
Okay, but fair verdict or not, Mr. Diplomacy?
I think it is a fair verdict, because what it does is it speaks to the living vitality of reasonable doubt, which is what juries are supposed to apply to the evidence. Some people don't like the answer. Doesn't make it unfair. It just means saying they would vote the other way. But since we have a system that says these people will make the decision and will abide by it, as opposed to what we saw in the DA's press conference, certainly if we decide we're going to abide by it, it's their call, and we're supposed to accept it.
Okay, Sandy Marks. Hang on, Otto Obermeyer. Go ahead, Sandy.
Well, I'll tell you, I agree with what David just said. And for a while I was really leaning towards the fact that they were going to find him guilty. After yesterday's little readback of the testimony, I was leaning very much towards being guilty. But I could not see the forest through the trees. And David is right. This was a case based on reasonable doubt. The defense did a terrific job of raising reasonable doubt. And the prosecution knew from day one that they had a problem with Mark Furman. He was a racist cop, and they were willing to put their case in his hands.
Well, okay, one more provocative question for the batch. John Burris, did they vote to acquit or did they vote to go home?
I think they voted to acquit based upon their reading of the evidence itself. But we have to remember, they've been seeing this evidence on a redundant basis over and over. They were formulating their opinions as they were going along. Mark Furman only helped to solidify those opinions, as well as the lack of motive and the police misconduct. So I think they voted to acquit, and they would have stayed there long as necessary to get it done, although there was some tension about leaving, but ultimately it was a vote to acquit.
Okay, let me up the ante just a little bit, Otto Obermeyer, which is if the same batch of officers, the same batch of investigators, the coroner's office, with botching, had still presented much better convincing evidence, would we be looking at a different verdict, or was the bias and the contamination and the attitude part on the part of the police officers and the investigators so important that it wouldn't matter what the physical evidence was?
No, I think had the case been presented differently, you might have a different result. It may have had a different jury. But I think what one can fault here is the process. The jury deliberated 4 hours, which was a very small period of time, and to reach its verdict. And I think people around the world have to say, what kind of criminal justice system do the Americans have, where a trial takes almost a year, 8 months,
and then in 4 hours a group of people say not guilty, and that ends it.
We have a system where people make very important decisions in even less time, either under pressure or for other reasons. But this jury had to weigh inferences from evidence. The evidence is agreed upon, and they're making their inferences as the evidence is coming in.
Okay, we've got to take a commercial break because we're already backing down to the end of segment 1, but O.J. Simpson's son read his statement, and part of that was that in earnest he's going to go out there and search for the real killers. How many of our guests thinks he's going to find them? Okay, let's take that commercial break and we'll answer that question when we come back. Justice system aside for just one moment of brief honesty here on Under Scrutiny. If he didn't kill him, who did, David Lewis?
I don't know that answer, but I do know that if we're having honesty, I've been saying for months that I thought he was going to be found guilty, and I've never been so spectacularly wrong for so long.
But you and the rest of the universe, it seems. Mary Shannon Little, back to the search for the real killers. Let's talk about how genuine that might be.
Well, listen, I don't know why OJ is having his family get on television saying he's now going to devote his life to searching for the real killers. I mean, just because the jury acquitted doesn't mean they don't believe he did it.
Okay, but don't you think that's the send-off for a public relations campaign that
yeah,
go ahead, John Burris.
I would say this, though, having spoken to the lawyers often during the course of this trial, and there's not one lawyer who's ever said to me, and having conversation with O.J. Simpson, that he ever remotely suggested he was the killer. He has always maintained that particular position, and if you look at this case, it may be he was not the killer, but I don't think that we ought to say cynically, because he is found not guilty and then goes out and makes this kind of offer, that somehow maybe he in fact is being cynical and sarcastic about this whole process.
Well, okay, but even Police Chief LAPD Police Chief Willie Williams said later this afternoon that the department is not intending to put a lot of effort into that real killer search.
You know, Jane, the federal government will. Why shouldn't there be an investigation on the federal side of the civil rights violations against Nicole and Goldman, just as there was when the police officers in the Rodney King case were acquitted? The federal government came in and did a civil rights
violation. We're backing me to the question,
which is this finding the murderers?
Well, I think what he's saying is this, Sandy Mark, score one for or against racism?
Well, look, racism played a major part in this case, and Johnny Cochran used the jury nullification issue, and he got them on a motion, and really basically asked them to forget about the law.
No.
But that's
he just set off a detonation. Hang on, John Burris, Robert Gottlieb.
We've been hearing all day, and we're seeing citizens talk about racism, and that this just shows that African Americans won't convict another African American. We are now entering a very dangerous period, and I think everyone has a responsibility to recognize that you just can't go now and start talking racism, and this reflects racism. This case has nothing to do ultimately with racism. It was an issue, but the real issue in this case was the lack of evidence.
I'd go one further. I would say, and John Burris, you pick up next because I interrupted you. I'd say the real issue in this case is the credibility of those handling and delivering the evidence, which leaves a message to police departments across the country, not to mention prosecutors.
Absolutely. This was a police issue and not a race issue. The race issue flowed, if anything, from the police issue, because then the jurors could then say, look, this is historically what happens when police officers try and go after black men, or etc. But racism flowed from the police conduct, and that's illustrated by Mark Furman and his conduct.
Bad
David Lewis.
Bad police work means that juries have to say we can't trust the state in its conclusions or its assumptions, and that's what we saw in this case.
Okay.
The problem is we felt differently watching it than the jury did in the jury.
But there's one other element, which is a history of racism on the part of the LAPD, not to mention several other big city police departments around the country. The criminal justice system is stacked up heavily in favor of black population over white. There is something behind the part of the country that's rejoicing here that echoes out beyond us.
absolutely.
Mary Shannon Little, go ahead.
There was something wrong with the fact that Marcia Clark put Mark Furman on the witness stand when she knew that Kathleen Bell would testify, called to testify, that he had said the N-word. That's a problem. This case was an issue of trust. When she put him on the witness stand and she let him testify perjuriously,
Well,
I mean, I'm not going to say it was a breach of ethics, but she lost the trust of that jury.
You had a member of law enforcement saying that he recovered a bloody glove on Simpson's property. You can, unless, as a prosecutor, you know he's lying.
She was
then
stuck.
you have
She
no,
didn't-
you then
she
you
didn't have
must
a
not
choice.
put him on the
No,
stand.
but that's
unless you
absolutely
can show,
right.
Mary, unless you're prepared to say that you can show that the prosecutors at that point knew he was lying, you can't tell a prosecutor not to put that guy on the stand.
No,
But you don't.
Hang on, wait a minute, we got 7 talking at once. Let Mary Shannon Little finish.
You don't embrace Mark Furman. You don't, and this is the problem with the prosecution. They represented the Goldman family, the Simpson family, the LAPD, and the coroner's office. They didn't represent the people of the state of California. They didn't represent dispassionate justice. Their job was to be unimpassioned, a search for the truth, which they keep on referring to. A 5-year-old child knows, by looking at Mark Furman's demeanor on cross-examination, that man had used the N-word. And as a prosecutor, they had an obligation. I mean, they knew about Kathleen Bell. They'd interviewed her.
Okay.
They had an obligation.
Go ahead quickly, John Burris.
It goes further than that. It goes to even Van Netter. It goes to the very issues of going over the wall and then lying about it when you got that search warrant. The #1 investigator, aside from Mac Furman, he lied, and he lied on an affidavit. So you had credibility issues from day one, and the district attorney's office embraced those lies.
Well, but you
and tried
also
to mitigate
had
them.
credibility issues that
That's
were
correct,
exploited
John.
very successfully and very deftly by the defense. Sandy Marks, I'm going to let you finish, and then I want to get into a different category. You got 15.
Well, you know, I agree with what John just said. This thing started way back when. It started back when they jumped over the fence. They didn't have the proper search warrant. They wanted to get O.J. Simpson, and Mark Furman made one statement, which we found out later on with McKinney, and he said if he goes down, the case goes down. And lo and behold, that's what's happened.
Okay, but I would argue actually in a longer show in a future format that this case started a long time before that, well back in the days when they started using that battering ram against random black homes in the Los Angeles area. But nonetheless, I open it, I close it when we come back. What does this mean for battered women in America? What does this put? What value does this put on the lives of the victims? Be right back. Sure, there's a lot of wives that say that, but she seemed to have meant it. Does this sort of negate the value of her life, which is snuffed out and gone?
I hope not. I mean, I think that it heightens everybody's focus on this particular problem, which is apparently a
Yeah, but you tell me this is going to light up the hotlines? I don't think so.
Well, the odd thing is that I think the police were gingerly with O.J. as opposed to severe with him. I mean, and I think that as a celebrity, he probably got away with it. It was a domestic dispute whenever she called, and they said, well, you know, we'll ultimately do it. The police ought to take these instances seriously and continue.
I think we've.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Sandy Marks first, then John Burris.
But there is a flip side to this. You know, here we all are looking at this thing, and maybe, just maybe, he is not the killer, and just maybe he may have abused her a couple of times, and maybe he started to get well, if you will. And maybe there is somebody else out there.
And maybe we'll all know the contents of that mystery envelope too, Sandy Marks, but I'm not holding my breath.
That's right.
Okay, John Burris.
Yeah, I'm going to say I do think there's some social benefit that's going to come out here, notwithstanding whatever the results of the case are. And we've already seen that. We've seen now that athletes are being looked at, arrested. Cops are coming, taking them away in the midst of these domestic violence cases, where in the past they might not have done that. So I think that if we're diligent from a public policy point of view, there can be some good.
Well, yes, sure, and again, but this trial is not going to further that cause. I think it's safe to say. Now, we also have a call late this afternoon by Maxine Waters, Congresswoman from California, to pursue Mark Furman on perjury charges.
Can I make a suggestion that politicians stay out of it? I think when you get involved...
Good luck.
That is
That's like keeping
unbelievable.
lawyers out of politics.
You know, when you have a tragedy like this, and you can see the Goldman family, you know, the Brown family, there are people who are hurting here. And for politicians now to jump on and start telling
but Mark Furman should hurt.
a U.S. attorney or a district attorney what to do, that is not their role.
Okay, but do you think that he should be pursued for perjury, Mary Shannon Little?
Absolutely.
Of course he should.
I mean, they have objective evidence.
I mean, what else are they going to do to make good with what looks like a really sour police reputation, well-deserved in a community?
How about it's the right thing to do whether there's a reputation or not? How about the fact is that when someone lies on the stand and it's a prosecutor's witness, usually there is no pursuit of perjury, it's the cost of the game. So it sends a message both to cops and to prosecutors that when they put someone on the stand and there's a question that they're lying, then that person has to take the risk that real people take.
But wait a second, you don't...
Oh my goodness, here we go again. Hang on. Go ahead, Mr. Gottlieb. Then Mr.
Because any prosecutor's job is not simply to go out and prosecute everybody when people are saying that he lied on the stand. There are certain rules, there's a certain law, whether or not it's material to his testimony, whether or not it was a material issue to the trial. You can't simply say, based on this, that Garcetti or a U.S. attorney should automatically tomorrow go into court and begin prosecuting somebody. There's much
Perjury.
more...
Okay, but let me back up. A previous episode in this very program where we all agreed that evidence credibility was a major problem in this trial and is not going to do most police departments in this country any big favors down the road.
Something, let me finish here, but perjury is something that if it's a material question, credibility is material, he should be prosecuted, but not just because he's a police officer, not because it's a criminal case. You should send a message to anybody who takes an oath, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case, that if you commit perjury, you get prosecuted. That's a much more significant rule.
We have less than a minute left, and I want to get to each and every one of you before we're out. That means keep it brief, please. We're going to start here on my left with Mr. Gottlieb. The biggest lesson of this trial to the American people. Go.
It's a tragic lesson. I think this trial did not or had very little redeeming social value. I think it became a circus. I think it became a mockery of the way the process should work.
You almost ate up 7 people's time. Mr. Lewis, quick.
Trials are not solutions to anything. They happen because everything else has failed.
And
the message is the more you put on this trial, the less it can hold. It is one man's fate decided by 12 people in a system that we have faith in when it works one way or the other.
Okay. They're forcing me to wrap up. We didn't even get 1/3 of the way through. I want to thank all of my guests tonight. Many of you are returnees. We're grateful for your service and your input over the course of the trial. And on that note, I'll be right back. The verdict is in. We've discussed it. I'm grateful to all of our guests throughout the O.J. trial and to you for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow night.